I turned 17 with hope in my heart and frost on the windows of our suburban Boston home. The December morning greeted me with silence, the same silence that had been growing in our house for months, though I'd been too afraid to acknowledge it. My parents hadn't mentioned my birthday in weeks. No hints about presents, no questions about what kind of cake I wanted. Nothing. I crawled out of bed and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Same brown eyes, same unruly hair that never quite behaved the way I wanted it to. But something felt different today. I was 17, practically an adult in my mind, though my parents still treated me like a child. The kitchen was empty when I went downstairs. A note sat on the counter in my mother's precise handwriting, meeting at church. Back at 6. No, happy birthday, Emma. No, sorry we missed you this morning. Just cold information, like I was a house guest they barely knew. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out eggs, milk, and butter. If no one was going to remember my birthday, I'd make my own cake. I found my grandmother's recipe book and flipped to the page with chocolate cake, the one she used to make for me before she passed away 3 years ago. The pages were stained with cocoa powder and vanilla extract from years of use. At least someone had cared enough to celebrate me once. As I mixed the batter, I hummed to myself, trying to push away the hollow feeling in my chest. The Warren house had never been particularly warm. My father, Richard, was a deacon at First Presbyterian and believed strongly in discipline and order. My mother, Helen, followed his lead in everything. I was their only child, the daughter who was supposed to be perfect. And for most of my life, I'd tried to be. I'd gotten straight A's. I'd attended youth group every Wednesday. I'd never broken curfew or talked back. But lately, something had shifted. Small comments from my father about my clothes being too revealing when I wore the same jeans as every other girl at Westfield High. My mother's tight smile when I mentioned wanting to study art instead of practical subjects like business or nursing. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The cake was in the oven when Mrs. Abernathy from next door knocked on our back door. She held a small wrapped gift and smiled when she saw me. Happy birthday, Emma, dear. I remembered from last year. I invited her in for tea, grateful for the company. Mrs. Abernathy had lived next to us for as long as I could remember. She was in her 70s now, with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She'd been more of a grandmother to me since mine had passed than my actual living relatives. Not celebrating with your parents? She asked, looking around the empty kitchen. They had a church meeting, I said, the lie slipping easily from my lips. I couldn't bear to tell her they'd forgotten. Or worse, that they'd remembered and simply didn't care. Mrs. Abernathy frowned slightly, but didn't press. Instead, she handed me this small package. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a paintbrush. For your art, she explained. You have such talent, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. After she left, I finished my cake and frosted it with chocolate icing. I set the table for 3, put on the blue dress my mother had once said looked nice on me, and waited. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7. At 8, I heard the car pull into the driveway. I straightened my dress and touched the bracelet on my wrist for luck. They walked in without looking at me. My father hung his coat in the hallway closet while my mother set her purse on the counter. Neither acknowledged the cake or the set table or me in my blue dress. Did you have dinner? My mother finally asked, her voice flat. I was waiting for you, I replied. It's my birthday. My father looked at me then, his gaze cold and unfamiliar. Something in his eyes made me step back. Richard, my mother said quietly. Not tonight. No, Helen. We agreed. He turned to me, shoulders squared like he was preparing for battle. Emma, we need to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, my birthday cake untouched between us. My father cleared his throat. Mrs. Dolan saw you last week, he began. At the art studio downtown. I nodded slowly. I've been taking classes there. With Mr. Rossi. With boys, my father corrected. Unsupervised. Drawing inappropriate things. My heart sank. We'd been drawing a male model clothed, but shirtless. Nothing scandalous, just standard practice for learning anatomy. But I knew how it would look to my father. It's a proper art class, I tried to explain. Everyone was there to learn. We found your sketchbook, my mother interrupted. She pulled it from her bag and laid it on the table. My private drawings. My thoughts. My soul on paper. They'd gone through my room. The violation made me feel physically ill. This isn't how we raised you, my father said, flipping to a page where I'd drawn two women embracing. It was a copy of a famous painting we'd studied. These ideas. These people you're spending time with. They're corrupting you. They're my friends, I whispered. They accept me. For what? My father demanded. For rejecting everything we've taught you? For embracing sin? The conversation spiraled from there. Years of tension exploded in a single night. Every small rebellion, every question I'd ever asked about their strict rules and narrow worldview, it all came pouring out. And with each word, I watched my parents' faces harden until I barely recognized them. When my father finally stood at the foot of the stairs, my mother silent behind him, his words didn't entirely surprise me. But they still cut deep. You are no longer our daughter, he said, voice steady as a judge delivering a sentence. I stood frozen, hoping desperately that this was some twisted test of faith or loyalty. But then he opened the front door and pointed outside. My clothes were in trash bags on the porch, already soaking in the December rain. My mother didn't say a word. She just turned away, arms crossed over her chest like she was holding herself together. Please, I begged. Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me how to fix it. But they wouldn't answer. My father simply took my house key from my trembling hand and closed the door as I stood in the storm, shivering in my blue dress, the taste of unshed tears mixing with the rain on my lips. That night, I slept under the highway overpass near Alewife Station, huddled against the concrete with only my backpack and the blue dress that was now torn at the hem. I was 17 years old, and it was my birthday, the day I was born into a new version of myself, one no one from my old life would ever recognize again. The first few weeks were the hardest. Boston winters show no mercy to the homeless. December turned to January, and the temperature dropped to levels that made my bones ache. I learned quickly where to find warmth, the public library until closing time, the 24-hour laundromat on Cambridge Street when the owner wasn't looking, the basement of St. Anthony's Church where Father Mike would sometimes turn a blind eye when he found me curled up near the boiler. I lost weight. My blue dress, the last piece of my former life, became too big, hanging loosely on my frame like a deflated balloon. I sold Mrs. Abernathy's bracelet at a pawn shop on Massachusetts Avenue to buy a used coat and a pair of boots. The guilt of parting with her gift twisted in my stomach, but survival demanded sacrifices. Most nights, I stayed at Pine Street and when there was space. On the nights there wasn't, I'd find a corner at South Station, blending in with commuters for as long as possible before security would inevitably ask for my ticket. I became good at looking busy, at appearing like I belonged somewhere, anywhere. You're too young to be out here alone, a woman named Darlene told me one night as we stood in line for a shelter bed. She had deep lines around her eyes and missing teeth, but her gaze was sharp and knowing. The streets will eat you alive, girl. I didn't have the energy to explain that I'd already been eaten alive once before, by the people who were supposed to love me most. What were a few more bites from strangers? By spring, I had a system. I'd found work washing dishes at Pino's Pizza in Central Square. The owner, Tony, paid me cash under the table, not much, but enough to occasionally sleep in a cheap motel when the shelters were full. He'd let me take leftover slices at the end of my shift, and sometimes even a whole pie if business had been slow. You remind me of my daughter, he told me once, his thick Italian accent wrapping around the words like a blanket. She at Northeastern now. Smart girl. You smart too, Emma. Emma. I still used my real name then. It hadn't occurred to me yet that I could be someone else entirely. Summer brought some relief from the cold but new problems. The heat made the shelters unbearable, overcrowded rooms filled with the sour smell of unwashed bodies and desperation. I started sleeping in Porter Square Park when the weather permitted, my backpack serving as both pillow and lifeline, always clutched to my chest. It was there that I met Zoe, a girl about my age with blue hair and more piercings than I could count. She'd run away from a foster home in Worcester after years of abuse that made my own story seem almost tame in comparison. "You won't last out here looking like that," she said bluntly, gesturing to my increasingly ragged appearance. "You look like prey." The next day, Zoe took me to a free clinic in Jamaica Plain where a volunteer stylist was offering haircuts. I sat in the folding chair and watched chunks of my long brown hair fall to the floor. The stranger in the mirror afterward had short, spiky hair dyed black with the clinic's donated supplies. I touched it gingerly, feeling something close to power for the first time since I'd been cast out. "See?" Zoe grinned. "Now you look like you'd put up a fight." We became inseparable after that. Zoe knew all the tricks, which restaurants would give free food at closing time, which convenience store clerks would look the other way if you pocketed a granola bar, which churches offered meals with no questions asked. She taught me to be invisible when necessary and intimidating when required. In August, we found an abandoned building in Dorchester where a group of other young people had created a makeshift community. We claimed a corner on the third floor, hanging sheets for privacy and using milk crates as furniture. It wasn't legal, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it was ours. For the first time since my parents had thrown me away, I had something resembling a home. Zoe and I took a job cleaning offices in the financial district at night. The company didn't look too closely at our obviously fake IDs, and the work, though exhausting, paid better than dishwashing. I started saving money, hiding cash in a ripped seam of my backpack, though for what purpose, I wasn't sure yet. "You should get your GED," said Marcus, one of our housemates in the abandoned building. He was 22 and taking classes at Bunker Hill Community College while working construction during the day. "Library has all the books you need to study. It's free to take the test if you're homeless." The idea took root. I'd been a good student before everything fell apart. While my fellow squatters smoked weed and drank cheap vodka in the evenings, I began spending my free time at the Boston Public Library, working through GED preparation books and using the public computers to take practice tests. By the following spring, I had my GED and a somewhat more stable situation. Zoe and I had found jobs at a boutique hotel in Back Bay. She worked the front desk night shift where her blue hair and piercings were hidden from the upscale clientele, and I cleaned rooms during the day. The manager let us stay in a storage room that had been converted to a tiny studio in the basement. It was barely legal housing, but it had a shower and a door that locked. I changed my hair again, this time to a natural-looking auburn. I started calling myself Beth, a tribute to Elizabeth Abernathy, the only adult who had shown me kindness on my last day as Emma Warren. With a fixed address, even an unofficial one, I was able to get a library card in my new name. I devoured books on psychology, fascinated by the science of why people do what they do, why parents might reject a child, why that child might still crave their approval despite everything. The boutique hotel job lasted almost a year before new management came in and discovered our arrangement. Zoe and I found ourselves back on the street, though this time with some savings and more knowledge of how to navigate homelessness. "We could go somewhere else," Zoe suggested as we sat on a bench near the Charles River, feeding stale bread to aggressive geese. "Start over in New York or Chicago. Somewhere no one knows us." But I wasn't ready to leave Boston. Something kept me tethered to the city where I'd been broken. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was rebuilding myself from the fragments my parents had left behind. Each new skill, each dollar saved, each day living on my own terms was another brick in the foundation of the person I was becoming. Zoe left for New York that fall. I found a room to rent in a house in Somerville with 4 other women, all of us, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. I picked up shifts at a coffee shop in Davis Square, took night classes in psychology at the community college, and started volunteering at a youth center for LGBTQ+ teens. The irony wasn't lost on me, helping kids who had been rejected by their families for the very same reasons I had been cast out. "You're good at this," my supervisor at the youth center told me. "The kids trust you. Have you thought about pursuing social work?" I had, actually. The idea of using my pain to help others like me held a certain poetic justice, but something else was brewing inside me too. Not just the desire to heal, but to confront. The wound my parents had inflicted hadn't scabbed over, it had hardened into something sharp and precise. A weapon I wasn't yet sure how to use. 3 years had passed since that rainy December night. I was 20 now, with a growing resume of jobs and volunteer positions. I had my own bank account, a driver's license in my new name, and even a battered Toyota Corolla I'd bought from one of my housemates. From the outside, I looked like any other young adult finding her way in the world. No one would guess that beneath my carefully constructed exterior lived a ghost, a dead girl walking. It was around this time that I started thinking about my parents again. Not with longing or even rage, but with a cold, calculating curiosity. Did they ever wonder what had happened to me? Did they ever regret their choice? Or had they simply erased me from their narrative, replacing their living daughter with a more convenient story? I found myself driving past our old house one Sunday morning, watching from across the street as they walked to their car in their church clothes, 3 years older, but otherwise unchanged. They looked ordinary. Not like monsters. Not like people who could throw their teenage daughter into the street on a winter night. Just a middle-aged couple heading to worship. The sight filled me with something unexpected. Not just anger, but determination. A quiet rage that had been building for years now had direction and purpose. I wasn't just going to survive their rejection, I was going to make them face it. Make them see exactly what they had discarded and what I had become despite them. I wasn't just going to return. I was going to haunt them like the ghost they had tried to bury too soon. The bookstore job came to me through Vanessa, one of my housemates who worked there part-time while finishing her degree at Tufts. The dusty shelf was exactly what its name suggested, a cramped, 2-story building in Somerville filled with teetering stacks of used books. The owner, Mr. Patel, was an Indian immigrant in his 70s who treated the store more like a personal library than a business. "We're not here to make money," he told me on my first day, adjusting his thick glasses. "We're here to find the right homes for these books. They speak to us, you know. Tell us where they need to go." The job paid less than my barista position, but there was something soothing about spending hours organizing shelves and cataloging new acquisitions. Mr. Patel let me take home any book I wanted as long as I wrote a short review for him when I finished. I felt a strange kind of peace there among the forgotten stories, as if I belonged among things that had been discarded but still held value. It was a Tuesday in late October when I found it. I'd been tasked with cleaning out the storage room, a space that hadn't seen a thorough cleaning since the Carter administration, according to Mr. Patel. Dust clung to every surface, and stacks of newspapers and magazines formed archaeological layers dating back decades. "Just toss anything older than 5 years," Mr. Patel instructed. "Except first editions or signed copies, of course." I was nearly finished, having filled 6 garbage bags with yellowed newspapers and water-damaged magazines, when a familiar name caught my eye. Warren. My heart skipped. It was a copy of the Westfield Chronicle from my hometown, dated about a year after I'd been thrown out. I shouldn't have looked. Part of me knew that nothing good could come from reopening that wound. But I couldn't help myself. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor and flipped through the pages, searching for whatever had caught my attention. When I found it, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, in the obituary section, was my own face staring back at me. A school photo from junior year, the last one taken before everything fell apart. My hair was still long then, my smile uncertain but hopeful. Emma Grace Warren, 17, tragically lost at sea during a family vacation to Cape Cod. Beloved daughter of Richard and Helen Warren of Westfield. A talented artist and dedicated student, Emma will be remembered for her kind heart and gentle spirit. She is preceded in death by her grandmother, Elizabeth Warren, and survived by her parents and extended family. Services will be held at First Presbyterian Church on Sunday. I read the paragraph 3 times, then a 4th, my hands shaking so badly that the edges of the paper rattled. Lost at sea. Beloved daughter. Talented artist. A vacuum-sealed bubble of hysterical laughter built in my chest. They had killed me off. Given me a tragic, blameless death far more palatable than the truth. No one in Westfield would ever know that they had thrown their only child into the street like garbage. Instead, They could play the part of the grieving parents, receiving casseroles and sympathy cards from neighbors who had no idea what they'd really done. The date of the obituary was July, 7 months after they'd disowned me. 7 months of me struggling to survive while they, what? Planned a fiction? Decided when and how their daughter would die? Did they wait those months to see if I'd come crawling back, begging for forgiveness? Or was it a practical matter, waiting for enough time to pass that a body wouldn't be expected to be recovered? I sat in that storage room for hours, the obituary clutched in my hands, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. Mr. Patel found me there when he came to lock up. "Beth, are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I showed him the obituary without explanation. He read it, then looked at me, then back at the paper. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding. "Emma," he said softly. It wasn't a question. I replied. "Once?" Mr. Patel didn't ask for the whole story, but I gave it to him anyway. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. My strict upbringing, the art classes my parents didn't approve of, my questions about their narrow faith, the birthday that became my unbirthday. As I spoke, Mr. Patel made us tea in the small kitchenette behind the register, adding extra honey to mine when he noticed the tears I was trying to hide. "My parents disowned me too," he said when I finished. "Different reasons. I married outside our caste, but the pain is the same. To be unmade by the people who made you, it leaves a particular kind of scar." "But they didn't just disown me," I said, tapping the obituary. "They erased me. Replace me with a tragic story that makes them look like victims instead of perpetrators." "And now you know," Mr. Patel observed. "What will you do with this knowledge?" The question hung between us in the dust-filled air of the bookstore. What would I do? What could I do? I was legally dead according to this newspaper. My parents had held a funeral, received condolences, perhaps even collected on a life insurance policy in my name. "I don't know," I admitted. But that wasn't entirely true. Already, something was taking shape in my mind, a plan born of pain and rage and the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. If I was dead to them, then perhaps that's exactly what I should become, a ghost returning to haunt those who had buried her prematurely. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed in the room I rented, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, the obituary on my nightstand like a ticking bomb. Questions multiplied in my mind. How many people had attended my funeral? Who had cried for me? What lies had my father told in his eulogy? By morning, I knew what I needed to do. I called in sick to the coffee shop and the bookstore, then drove to the Boston Public Library. There, in the quiet of the research section, I used their computers to search for more information. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The First Presbyterian Church website had an archive of memorial services. There it was, Emma Warren, service held on July 15th, 3 years ago. There was even a digital copy of the program. My school photo on the front, Bible verses about the sea giving up its dead on the day of resurrection. Inside, a list of hymns and speakers, including my father, my mother's brother Uncle Paul, and my former youth pastor. Further searching revealed a GoFundMe that had been set up to help my parents with unexpected funeral expenses. It had raised over $12,000. The comments section was filled with sympathy and shared memories. My high school art teacher, Ms. Wilson, had written about my gentle soul and artistic gift. Friends I'd had since elementary school posted about how they would miss me. Even Mrs. Abernathy had contributed, though her comments simply read, "The truth comes to light eventually." I wondered if she had suspected something. She had been our neighbor for decades and knew my parents better than most. Had she seen through their performance of grief? After the library, I drove to Westfield for the first time in years. I didn't have a particular destination in mind. I just needed to see the town where I'd grown up, where I'd died without dying. I parked near the high school and watched students stream out at the end of the day. Kids I had known, now 3 years older, living their lives as if I had never existed. Or rather, as if I had existed and then tragically disappeared beneath the waves off Cape Cod. On impulse, I drove to the cemetery behind First Presbyterian. If there had been a funeral, there would be a grave. Would they have gone that far in their charade? A headstone with my name seemed like an unnecessary expense for a body supposedly lost at sea. But there it was, a simple gray marble marker in the newer section of the cemetery. Emma Grace Warren, it read. Beloved daughter, return to God's embrace. The dates of my birth and supposed death were etched below. I stood before my own grave, a peculiar sense of vertigo washing over me. Here lay the girl my parents wanted, the obedient daughter who asked no questions, who fit neatly into their idea of what a child should be. Not the real Emma, with her messy questions and inconvenient talents and capacity for independent thought. That Emma had been exiled, erased, replaced with this sanitized version who had the good grace to die tragically rather than challenge their worldview. I knelt and touched the cold stone, tracing the letters of my name. The rage I'd felt earlier transformed into something colder, more focused. They hadn't just thrown me away, they had rewritten me. Created a fictional daughter whose death they could mourn publicly while privately knowing they had cast out the real one to an uncertain fate. Did they ever wonder if I was alive? Did they check the news for unidentified bodies found in Boston, girls matching my description? Or did they sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that their shame had been buried along with their fictional daughter's empty casket? As I stood to leave, I noticed a fresh bouquet of daisies leaning against the headstone. Someone had been here recently. My mother, perhaps, maintaining the fiction for any passers-by who might notice an untended grave. The image of her placing flowers on an empty grave while I struggled to survive on the streets of Boston ignited something in me that had been smoldering for years. I made a decision then, standing over my own grave in the fading October light. I would attend my own funeral, 3 years late, but better than never. Not the sanitized ceremony they had held when they thought no one would question their story, but a true reckoning. I would force them to face what they had done, to acknowledge the real Emma they had tried to erase. The idea took root and grew as I drove back to Boston, gathering momentum and details with each passing mile. I would need a disguise, something subtle enough that I wouldn't be immediately recognized, but would allow for the dramatic revelation I envisioned. I would need information about their current lives, their routines, their vulnerabilities. And I would need the perfect moment to return from the dead. When I got back to my rented room, I found the box where I kept the few possessions I'd managed to grab before my parents locked me out, my sketchbook, a few photos, the torn blue dress. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a silver locket my grandmother had given me before she died. Inside was a tiny photo of us together from when I was about 8. I put it on, tucking it beneath my shirt so the cool metal rested against my skin. I'm coming back, Grandma, I whispered to the empty room. Not as their daughter, but as the truth they tried to bury. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in years, lulled by the certainty of my new purpose. I would no longer be running from my past or trying to build a life despite it. Instead, I would use it, weaponize it. The dead girl they had created would return, not seeking reconciliation or forgiveness, but justice. Emma Warren was dead. But I wasn't. And soon, Richard and Helen Warren would have to confront the ghost they had created through their own cruelty and lies. It took me 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks of careful planning, of gathering information and materials, of steeling myself for what would come next. I told my housemates I was visiting a friend in New York. I called in personal days at both jobs. I couldn't risk anyone trying to contact me when I was in the middle of my resurrection. First came the disguise. I visited a salon in Cambridge where the stylist didn't ask questions when I showed her a photo of what I wanted, a shoulder-length blonde bob, completely different from both my natural brown hair and the various colors I'd experimented with since leaving home. The color transformed me, softening my features and creating just enough distance from the teenager my parents had known. I bought a black dress from a consignment shop in Beacon Hill, conservative enough for a church service but expensive-looking. Designer sunglasses completed the look. When I practiced in front of the mirror in my rented room, I barely recognized myself. Good. Recognition would come later on my terms. Next came the intelligence gathering. I made another trip to Westfield, this time parking a block away from First Presbyterian and waiting. Sunday service let out at 11:30. I watched from behind my sunglasses as the congregation spilled onto the steps. My parents emerged among the last, my father shaking hands with the pastor, my mother smiling that tight smile I remembered so well. They looked older, of course. My father's hair had gone completely gray. My mother had gained weight. But their posture, the way they held themselves apart from others, even in a crowd, that remained unchanged. I followed them to a restaurant where they had lunch with another couple, the Holdens, who had been fixtures at church as long as I could remember. I sat at the bar, nursing a club soda, close enough to hear snippets of their conversation, but not so close as to draw attention. The mission trip to Guatemala, my father was saying. Richard Jr.'s youth group raised almost $5,000. Richard Jr. My replacement, I realized with a jolt. They'd had another child. He would be, 2 years old now? A son to replace the daughter they'd thrown away. Bile rose in my throat. I paid for my drink and left before I could be noticed. In the parking lot, I leaned against my car, trying to breathe through the shock. They had moved on completely. A new child, a new life. While I had been haunted by their rejection every day for 3 years, they had simply started over. The final piece fell into place a week later. I'd been monitoring the church's website daily, looking for anything I could use. That's when I saw it, an announcement for a memorial service. Join us in remembering those our congregation has lost, it read. A service specifically for families who had experienced the death of a loved one in the past 5 years. My name was on the list of those to be honored. It was almost too perfect. A second funeral, 3 years after the first. A chance for my parents to refresh their grief, to receive another round of sympathy for their loss. And the perfect stage for my return. The day of the service dawned bright and clear, unseasonably warm for November in Massachusetts. I woke early, my stomach in knots. I dressed carefully in the black dress and heels, applied makeup with a steady hand despite my nerves, and styled my new blonde hair. The woman in the mirror looked sophisticated, put together. No one would connect her to the frightened 17-year-old who had been cast out into the rain. I drove to Westfield with the windows down, letting the cool air calm my racing thoughts. What exactly did I hope to accomplish today? Revenge, certainly. Justice, perhaps. But there was something else too, something I was reluctant to admit even to myself, a desperate, childish hope that seeing me alive might awaken some dormant love in my parents' hearts. That they might realize what they had thrown away and beg for forgiveness. I squashed that hope ruthlessly. I hadn't come for reconciliation. I had come to make them face the truth. The church parking lot was half full when I arrived. I chose a spot near the back, giving myself a clear exit if needed. I checked my reflection one last time in the rearview mirror, then slipped on my sunglasses and stepped out into the sunshine. The church looked smaller than I remembered, its white steeple less imposing. I climbed the steps slowly, nodding at a few unfamiliar faces who held the door for me. Inside, the foyer was filled with hushed conversations and the scent of lilies. A poster board displayed photos of the deceased being honored today. My school photo was among them, that same one from the obituary. Beneath it, someone had written, "Forever in our hearts." I swallowed hard and moved into the sanctuary. It was about half full, with people clustered in small groups. I chose a seat near the back on the aisle and pretended to look through the program while scanning the room for familiar faces. There, my mother's sister, Aunt Judith, who had always been kind to me in her distant way. A few rows ahead, my former youth pastor and his wife. And near the front, my parents, sitting stiffly side by side. A toddler squirmed on my mother's lap, Richard Jr., I presumed. My replacement. My stomach clenched at the sight. The service began with a hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," my grandmother's favorite. The irony wasn't lost on me. The pastor welcomed everyone, speaking of loss and healing and God's mysterious ways. I barely heard the words. My attention was fixed on my parents, on the back of their heads, on the way my mother's shoulders shook slightly during the prayer. Then came the remembrances. One by one, family members came forward to speak briefly about their loved ones. A teenage boy talked about his brother who had died of cancer. An elderly man remembered his wife of 50 years. And then my father stood, straightening his tie as he approached the pulpit. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady, Our daughter Emma was taken from us too soon. Taken. As if some external force had snatched me away. As if he hadn't opened the door himself and pointed to my belongings on the rain-soaked porch. Emma was a bright light, he continued. A talented artist with a gentle spirit and a kind heart. My fingernails dug into my palms. This description bore little resemblance to the real me, the me they had rejected for asking questions, for wanting more. Then the narrow life they had planned. Not a day goes by that Helen, and I don't think of her, don't wonder what she would be doing now. Would she be in college? Would she have found her purpose? These questions remain unanswered, but we take comfort in knowing that God holds her in his hands. Tears pricked at my eyes behind my sunglasses. Not from grief, but from rage. The sheer audacity of his lies, spoken so convincingly that I almost believed them myself. In his version of events, they were the victims of a tragedy, not the perpetrators of cruelty. As he returned to his seat, placing a comforting hand on my mother's shoulder, something in me hardened. The childish hope I'd been harboring, that some part of them might still love me, withered and died. They weren't mourning the real me. They were mourning the fictional daughter they had created, the one who had died rather than disappointed them. The pastor invited everyone to come forward and place a white rose on the altar in memory of their loved ones. My parents went first, each holding a rose, my mother carrying little Richard, helping his pudgy hand place a third flower alongside theirs. A perfect family portrait of grief. Others followed, my aunt, a few church members I recognized, even my high school principal. And then, before I could lose my nerve, I stood and walked down the aisle. Conversations hushed as I passed. I felt eyes on me, the unfamiliar blonde woman in black, not part of their community, but moving with purpose toward the altar. I placed my rose among the others, directly beside the three my family had left. And then, with deliberate calm, I removed my sunglasses and turned to face the congregation. For a moment, there was only silence. I scanned the room, making eye contact with each person who had known me. Some showed confusion, the blonde hair had done its job. Others squinted, uncertainty giving way to shock as they recognized something familiar in my features. My gaze finally landed on my parents in the front row. My mother's face had gone completely white, her arms tightening reflexively around little Richard. My father stood frozen, mouth slightly open, as if he'd seen, well, a ghost. My name, I said, my voice ringing clearly in the stunned silence, is Emma Grace Warren. And as you can see, I'm not dead. The church erupted in gasps and whispers. Someone near the back let out a small scream. My Aunt Judith's hand flew to her mouth. But I kept my eyes fixed on my parents, watching as their carefully constructed fiction collapsed around them in real time. I didn't drown at Cape Cod, I continued, taking a step toward them. I never went to Cape Cod. 3 years ago, on my 17th birthday, I was thrown out of my home and told I was no longer a daughter. I wasn't taken by the sea. I was discarded by the two people who should have loved me most. My voice didn't waver. I had rehearsed these words 100 times, but speaking them aloud, in this place, before these witnesses, it felt like lancing a wound that had festered for years. I came here today because I wanted to see how many people would mourn a lie. The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. I stood before the altar, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The church felt airless, as if every person had collectively held their breath. My eyes remained fixed on my parents, watching as the initial shock on their faces transformed into something more complex: fear, anger, shame, all battling for dominance. It was my mother who broke first. "Emma," she whispered, her voice so small it barely carried to where I stood. She half rose from her seat, swaying slightly. Little Richard began to fuss in her arms, sensing the tension. My father recovered more quickly. His face hardened into the stern mask I remembered so well from my childhood. He stood and turned to the congregation, raising his hands as if to calm a spooked animal. "Please," he said, his pastor's voice firmly in place, "I think it would be best if everyone gave our family some privacy. Pastor Jim, perhaps we could move to your office." People began to murmur, exchanging glances. No one moved. The spectacle was too compelling, the drama too unexpected. My father's authority, usually unquestioned in this church, seemed to have evaporated in the face of his dead daughter's return. "I think everyone should stay," I said clearly. "After all, you've made my death a public matter. My return should be equally public." My Aunt Judith stood suddenly. "For God's sake, Richard, what is she talking about? You told us she drowned." More voices joined in, a rising chorus of confusion and accusation. Mrs. Abernathy pushed her way to the front, her face a mixture of shock and vindication. "I knew it," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I knew something wasn't right. You never grieved like parents who had lost a child. The pastor approached the pulpit, trying to regain control of the situation. "Please, brothers and sisters, let's remember where we are. This is a house of God, a place of peace. It's also supposed to be a place of truth," I interrupted. "But there's been very little of that here today." I turned back to my parents. Tell them how you threw me out for taking art classes you didn't approve of. Tell them how you packed my belongings in garbage bags and left them in the rain. Tell them how you never looked for me, never checked if I was safe or alive or sleeping under a bridge." My father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He stepped into the aisle, pointing a finger at me. "You don't know what you're talking about. You were rebellious, disobedient. You rejected everything we taught you." I asked questions, I corrected him. I wanted to learn about the world beyond this church, beyond your rules. That was my sin. My mother had begun to cry, clutching Richard Jr. to her chest as if I might snatch him away. "We did what we thought was right," she said through her tears. "You were going down a dangerous path. We tried to save you. Save me?" I couldn't keep the incredulous laugh from escaping. "By throwing me onto the street? By declaring me dead? That's not salvation, Mother. That's abandonment." The congregation had grown restless, people talking over each other, some leaving their pews to approach my parents or the pastor. Mrs. Abernathy had made her way to my side, her weathered hand finding mine and squeezing it tight. "I never believed their story," she whispered to me. "I looked for you, you know. Asked around at shelters in Boston. But you had disappeared so completely." Her words sent a fresh wave of emotion through me. Someone had looked for me. Someone had cared enough to try. My cousin Megan pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "Uncle Richard, Aunt Helen, how could you? How could you lie to all of us for years? We mourned her. We brought you food and sent cards and, oh my God, the GoFundMe. You collected money for a funeral that never happened." The mention of money seemed to break something open in the room. People who had been uncertain now turned fully against my parents, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. The Holdens, who had been having lunch with my parents just weeks earlier, stood and walked out without a word. Others followed, shaking their heads, whispering among themselves. Through it all, my father maintained his rigid posture, though I could see the panic building behind his eyes. Everything he had built, his reputation, his position in the church, his carefully crafted image of moral authority, was crumbling before him. "Emma," he said, switching tactics, his voice softening to the tone he had used when I was a child and had disappointed him. "You're clearly troubled. Whatever you've been through these past years has clouded your memory. Come home with us. We can talk about this privately, as a family." The offer momentarily stunned me. After everything, he thought I would simply follow him home like an obedient daughter? That I would help him sweep this public revelation under the rug? "I'm not troubled," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm finally seeing clearly. And I didn't come here for reconciliation, Father. I came here for truth." I turned to address the remaining congregation members, who watched in stunned silence. 3 years ago, I was 17. I had committed no crime. I had broken no law. My only transgression was wanting to study art, to ask questions about faith that went beyond simple acceptance. For that, I was cast out with nothing but the clothes on my back. No money, no support, no goodbye. While I was sleeping in shelters and on park benches, my parents were here, accepting your sympathy and your casseroles, pretending to mourn a daughter they had chosen to throw away. My voice broke slightly on the last words, the first crack in my carefully maintained composure. Mrs. Abernathy's hand tightened around mine. And now they have a new child, I continued, nodding toward Richard Jr., who had begun to wail in earnest. A replacement. A second chance to raise someone who won't question or challenge them. A daughter was too difficult, too unpredictable. Better to try again with a son. My mother gasped, clutching the toddler tighter. That's not true. We never. But her protest died on her lips, withering under the collective gaze of friends and neighbors who were seeing her, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. My father made one last attempt to regain control. This is slander, he declared, his voice rising. Our daughter was troubled. She ran away. We searched for months. When we couldn't find her, we had to accept the worst. The memorial was a way for us to find closure, to heal bullshit, said a voice from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Wilson, my former art teacher, standing in the aisle. I came to you 2 weeks after Emma disappeared. I told you I thought I had seen her at South Station. You said I was mistaken, that Emma had died in an accident. You lied to my face, Richard. More voices joined in, more stories of my parents' deception emerging. The youth pastor's wife remembered calling with information about a teen shelter in Boston that might help in the search, only to be told that Emma was with God now. A former classmate had asked about sending birthday cards to me in heaven, an idea my mother had encouraged. The fabrication was unraveling thread by thread, leaving my parents exposed before their community. My father's face had gone from red to ashen, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. My mother had collapsed back into her pew, sobbing openly now as my aunt tried to take the screaming toddler from her arms. I felt no triumph in their humiliation, no pleasure in watching their social standing disintegrate. What I felt was something closer to relief, the profound unburdening that comes with truth finally spoken aloud after years of silence. I didn't come here to destroy you, I said quietly, addressing my parents directly. I came here to reclaim my name, my story. You tried to write my ending, but it wasn't yours to write. The pastor, who had been watching the scene unfold with increasing distress, finally stepped forward. I think, he said carefully, that we should end the service here. Everyone, please give the Warren family space to process this revelation. He turned to me, clearly unsure how to address the formerly deceased. Ms. Warren, perhaps you would be willing to speak with your parents privately, with me present as a mediator? I considered the offer. Part of me wanted to simply walk away, to leave them to deal with the consequences of their deception without me. But something held me there, not hope for reconciliation, but a need for closure that felt tantalizingly close. All right, I agreed. But Mrs. Abernathy stays with me. The pastor nodded and gestured toward his office. As we made our way through the whispering congregation, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Aunt Judith, her eyes red from crying. Emma, she said, her voice breaking. I had no idea. You have to believe me. They told us it was an accident. That you had gone swimming and she couldn't continue. I believe you, I said, and I did. My parents' deception had claimed many victims beyond me. In the pastor's office, with its dark wood paneling and smell of old books, we sat in strained silence. My father had regained some of his composure, though he avoided looking directly at me. My mother continued to weep quietly, Richard Jr. now asleep against her shoulder despite the tension in the room. Before we begin, the pastor said, I want to say that I am deeply troubled by what I've heard today. If what Emma says is true, it is, Mrs. Abernathy interrupted firmly. I was there the night they threw her out. I saw the bags on the porch. I heard Emma begging to know what she had done wrong. My father's head snapped up. You had no right to interfere in family matters, Elizabeth. What happens in our home, child abandonment, isn't a family matter, Richard, Mrs. Abernathy shot back. It's abuse. It's criminal. You're lucky Emma isn't pressing charges. The idea hadn't even occurred to me. Could I have pursued legal action against my parents? Would it have made any difference now, 3 years later? The thought dissipated as quickly as it had formed. Legal justice wasn't what I had come for. I don't want to press charges, I said. I don't want anything from you, really. I just couldn't let the lie stand any longer. I looked at my mother, who had finally met my gaze. You can keep playing perfect parents to Richard Jr. You can keep your place in this church if they'll still have you. But you don't get to mourn me anymore. You don't get to pretend you lost a daughter to tragedy when you threw her away by choice." My mother's face crumpled. "Emma, please. We were wrong. We were scared and wrong. Come home. Let us make it right." The plea might have moved me once. 3 years ago, even 1 year ago, I might have leapt at the chance for reconciliation, for a return to the family that had defined my entire identity. But I was no longer that desperate girl. I had built myself anew from the ashes of their rejection. "My home isn't with you anymore," I said. "It hasn't been for a long time." My father, who had been silently watching our exchange, finally spoke. "What do you want from us, then? Money? Public apology? What will it take for you to put this behind us?" His question revealed everything. He still saw me as a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed, not a daughter to be loved. "I don't want anything from you," I repeated. "I just wanted the truth to be known. Not for revenge, but because lies like yours don't just hurt me. They hurt everyone who believed in you, who mourned a death that never happened." I stood, suddenly eager to be gone from this place, from these people who now felt like strangers. "The coffin you bought," I said, pausing at the door. "Think of it as a gift. A place to bury your lies." I walked out without looking back, Mrs. Abernathy's steady presence beside me as we made our way through the now empty sanctuary. Outside, the November sun was beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the church steps. "What now?" Mrs. Abernathy asked as we reached my car. I took a deep breath of the crisp air, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Now I go home. My real home." The drive back to Boston was quiet. Mrs. Abernathy sat beside me, occasionally reaching over to pat my hand when tears threatened to spill. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? The confrontation that had consumed my thoughts for weeks was over, leaving a strange hollowness in its wake. "You can stay with me tonight," Mrs. Abernathy offered as we crossed the city line. "I don't think you should be alone." I considered it. The thought of returning to my rented room, to the sympathetic but ultimately uncomprehending faces of my housemates, held little appeal. But Mrs. Abernathy's house was in Westfield, too close to the epicenter of the day's emotional earthquake. "Thank you," I said, "but I need to get back to my life in Boston. I've been away from it for too long already." We compromised. I dropped her at South Station to catch the commuter rail back to Westfield, but not before she extracted a promise that I would call her the next day. As I watched her silver head disappear into the crowd, I felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had been more family to me in the past few hours than my biological parents had been in years. The city welcomed me back with its familiar noise and energy, the streets still bustling despite the late hour. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the events of the day settle in my mind. The confrontation hadn't gone exactly as I'd planned. It had been messier, more chaotic, the emotions rawer than I had anticipated. But it was done. The truth was out. Whatever happened next was no longer my responsibility. When I finally returned to the triple-decker in Somerville where I rented a room, my housemate Vanessa was sitting on the front steps, smoking a cigarette, a habit she indulged only when stressed. "There you are," she said, standing as I approached. "We were getting worried. You weren't answering your phone." I realized I hadn't checked my phone since before the service. I pulled it from my bag to find a dozen missed calls and texts from my housemates and coworkers. "Sorry," I said, sinking onto the step beside her. "It's been a complicated day." Vanessa studied my face in the dim glow of the streetlight. "You look different," she observed. "Not just the hair. Something else." "I feel different," I admitted. And I did. Lighter somehow, but also more solidly myself. As if by confronting the past, I had finally freed myself from its gravity. I didn't tell her everything that night, just enough to explain my absence and unusual appearance. The full story would come later, shared in pieces over late-night cups of tea in our kitchen, or whispered confidences during long drives to the Cape in summer. But that night, I simply needed to exist in the present, in the life I had built for myself despite everything. The next few days passed in a blur of mundane normalcy that felt surreal after the drama of the memorial service. I returned to my jobs at the coffee shop and the bookstore. I attended my psychology class at the community college. I volunteered at the youth center. No one here knew what had happened in Westfield. No one treated me any differently. It was both comforting and disorienting. News from Westfield trickled in through Mrs. Abernathy's daily calls. My parents had withdrawn from church activities to focus on family healing, according to the official announcement. The congregation was divided, some rallying around them with Christian forgiveness, others openly critical of their deception. The pastor had visited twice, trying to mediate some kind of reconciliation. My mother had called Mrs. Abernathy in tears, begging for my contact information, which Mrs. Abernathy had refused to provide without my permission. They're facing consequences, Mrs. Abernathy told me. Maybe for the first time in their lives. I found I didn't particularly care. The anger that had fueled me for so long had burned out, leaving behind not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, but a kind of detached acceptance. They were who they were. They had done what they had done. My life would continue regardless. But there were practical matters to address. My legal status, for one. I had been living as Beth Miller for 3 years, working jobs that paid cash under the table, existing in a gray area just outside the system. But if I wanted to build a real future, finish college, pursue a career, have a life that wasn't limited by my semi-official status, I needed to reclaim my identity. "You need a lawyer," Mr. Patel said when I explained the situation to him at the bookstore. "I have a niece who specializes in family law. She'll help you for a reduced fee, I'm sure of it." Nisha Patel was a force of nature in a tailored suit, her office in downtown Boston sleek and modern compared to her uncle's dusty bookstore. She listened to my story without interruption, taking occasional notes, her expression giving nothing away. "So legally, you're dead," she summarized when I finished. "But physically, obviously, you're very much alive. And your parents knowingly filed a false death report, possibly committed insurance fraud, and definitely collected charitable donations under false pretenses." She tapped her pen against her notepad, thinking, "We have leverage. They won't want this to become public record, the fraud, I mean. The abandonment of a minor, too, though the statute of limitations might be an issue there. But we can use that to negotiate a clean reinstatement of your legal identity without dragging everyone through court." I hadn't considered using legal pressure against my parents. The idea made me uncomfortable, not out of residual loyalty, but because it meant continued engagement with them when all I wanted was to move on. "I don't want their money," I said. "I don't want to punish them more than they've already been punished. I just want my name back." Nisha nodded. "We'll focus on that then. But don't dismiss potential compensation too quickly. They owe you support that you never received. That's not punishment, it's justice." The legal process took months. Forms filed, affidavits signed, bureaucratic hurdles navigated. Through it all, Nisha advocated fiercely on my behalf, sometimes frightening in her intensity. "This is personal for me," she admitted during one particularly frustrating meeting with state officials. "My parents would have disowned me for marrying my wife if Uncle Vikram hadn't intervened. The idea that parents can just throw away children who don't meet their expectations, it makes me want to burn things down." By spring, we had reached a settlement. My death certificate was officially nullified. My legal identity as Emma Warren was restored. My parents agreed to pay for my college education, past, present, and future, and provide a modest sum for the years of support I should have received as their dependent. In return, I signed an agreement not to pursue criminal charges or speak publicly about the specifics of our settlement. It was both more and less than I had expected. More, in the sense that I hadn't anticipated any financial compensation. Less, in that the resolution felt strangely anticlimactic, just signatures on paper, no dramatic confrontations or tearful reconciliations. "Are you satisfied?" Nisha asked as we left her office after the final meeting, the signed agreement tucked safely in her briefcase. "I think so," I said. "It's just strange to be Emma Warren again. I've been Beth Miller for so long." She studied me thoughtfully. "You know, legally changing your name is much easier than coming back from the dead. If you want to be Beth Miller or anyone else, that's an option." I hadn't considered that possibility. The goal had been to reclaim my identity, to take back what had been stolen from me. But what if I didn't want to be Emma Warren anymore? Not because that name was dead, but because I had outgrown it? The question stayed with me in the weeks that followed. I finished the semester at the community college with straight A's and received my acceptance letter to Boston University's psychology program for the fall, my education now fully funded thanks to the settlement. I gave notice at the coffee shop, but kept my weekend shifts at the bookstore, unwilling to completely sever that connection to Mr. Patel and the quiet sanctuary he had created among the dusty shelves. Mrs. Abernathy continued to call regularly, though her reports from Westfield grew less frequent as the scandal faded from local memory. My parents had withdrawn further from community life, my father taking early retirement from his position at the insurance company where he'd worked for 20 years. My mother had reached out once more, sending a card to Mrs. Abernathy's address, a tentative olive branch that I wasn't yet ready to accept. "They're trying," Mrs. Abernathy said gently. "In their own way." "That's good for them," I replied, not unkindly but with firm boundaries. "But I'm not ready for a relationship." I might never be. Summer brought changes. I moved out of the Somerville triple-decker into a small studio apartment in Cambridge, closer to BU. The settlement money made this possible, a fact that sometimes made me uncomfortable, as if I were profiting from my own trauma. But Nisha had been right. It wasn't punishment. It was belated support that should have been mine all along. I volunteered more hours at the youth center, working specifically with teens who had been rejected by their families because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. My own experience gave me insight that the other volunteers, however well-meaning, couldn't match. I understood the particular pain of familial rejection, the way it hollowed you out from the inside, leaving you feeling simultaneously weightless and leaden. "You're good at this," my supervisor, Michael, told me after watching me talk a 16-year-old girl through a panic attack triggered by a chance encounter with her estranged father. "You connect with them in a way most people can't." "I've been where they are," I said simply. "Have you thought about pursuing this professionally? Social work, maybe, or counseling?" I had, actually. The psychology courses I'd been taking had increasingly focused on trauma and resilience. The idea of using my own painful experience to help others navigate similar terrain held a certain poetic justice that appealed to me. It was around this time that I made my decision about my name. On a warm August afternoon, I sat in Mr. Patel's bookstore during a quiet moment, a legal name change form spread out before me. "So you've decided," he said, noticing the paperwork. "I have," I replied. "I'm not going back to being Emma Warren. But I'm not staying Beth Miller either." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "Who will you be then?" I smiled, feeling the rightness of the decision settling into my bones. "Elizabeth Abernathy Morton." Elizabeth for Mrs. Abernathy, who looked for me when no one else did. Abernathy to honor her directly. And Morton was my grandmother's maiden name, the only family member who loved me unconditionally. Mr. Patel nodded approvingly. "A good, strong name with meaning. A name you chose for yourself rather than one given to you." "Exactly," I said, beginning to fill out the form with steady hands. This way, every time someone calls me by name, I'm reminded of the people who truly loved me, not the ones who threw me away. That fall, as Elizabeth Abernathy Morton, I began my studies at Boston University. I found an internship at a women's shelter in Dorchester, working with mothers and children who had fled abusive homes. I joined a support group for estranged adult children, where I finally found people who truly understood the complex grief of being rejected by family. I adopted a 3-legged cat from a shelter and named her Phoenix, a small, daily reminder of rising from ashes. Sometimes, people ask if I ever think about my parents. I do, but not in the way they might expect. Not with yearning or even anger anymore. I think of them with clarity and a strange kind of gratitude. They taught me, through painful example, how not to love. They showed me the devastating power of conditional acceptance. And in throwing me away, they inadvertently set me on a path to becoming someone stronger and more compassionate than I might otherwise have been. My story began with rejection, but it doesn't end there. It continues, evolving daily, each moment a choice to build rather than destroy, to connect rather than isolate, to love without conditions or expectations. I may have been born into their house, but I raised myself from the ashes of their abandonment. And that, I've come to believe, is the most beautiful revenge of all, to thrive not despite their rejection, but because it forced me to discover strengths I never knew I possessed. I am Elizabeth now, a name I chose, a person I built, an identity I claimed. The girl they buried lives on, transformed but undefeated, her spirit intact despite everything. And in that survival, that reinvention, I have found a victory more profound than any confrontation could have provided. This, then, is my true resurrection, not the moment I stood in that church and declared myself alive, but every day since, every choice to move forward rather than remain trapped in the past. Every time I help a lost teenager find shelter, every class I excel in, every moment I choose compassion over bitterness. These are the real miracles. I turned 20 on last December. I baked my own birthday cake again, but this time I wasn't alone. My chosen family gathered in my small apartment: Mr. Patel and his niece Nisha, Mrs. Abernathy, who had made the trip from Westfield despite the snow, my housemates from Somerville, colleagues from the youth center, friends from classes and support groups. People who knew my story and loved me not despite it, but with full acknowledgement of all I had survived. As I blew out the candles, Mrs. Abernathy caught my eye across the flickering lights. "Make a wish, Elizabeth," she said, using my new name with the same affection she had once reserved for Emma. I closed my eyes and wished not for reconciliation or revenge or even happiness. I wished simply for continuation, for the strength to keep building this life I had claimed from the wreckage of abandonment, for the wisdom to use my pain as a bridge to others rather than a wall, for the courage to remain open to love despite knowing how deeply rejection can cut. When I opened my eyes, the smoke from the extinguished candles curled upward like a question mark, like the beginning of a story still being written. My story. Not perfect, not finished, but undeniably, triumphantly mine.